Nice to meet everybody. Thanks for coming to this session. So microservices has become extremely important to many of our customers, probably many of you. Microservices third-party APIs allow us to become more agile as we roll out code and build new features. And it allows us to leverage the best of the best out in the marketplace. Before we dive into this, I want to just, again, mention the same disclaimer that we mention most of the time, that this information is not anything that's represented, et cetera, et cetera. So real quick, in terms of understanding the audience here, how many of you use microservices currently? Okay. How many are considering microservices or evaluating them? Great. So for those who have microservices, how many have at least 10 that you're leveraging for your core application? Okay. So some folks are leveraging dozens to hundreds, and we're going to talk about what that can mean for your business, and that's part of the discussion today. So the agenda is thinking about microservices from your customer's perspective, depending on the business that you're in, whether you're in e-commerce, if you have a media site, if you have a SaaS product, what can that mean in terms of the value of them and how you think about prioritizing and monitoring them. Thinking a little bit about service quality and microservices sprawl as you have more and more of these. How does it impact quality? But then also some of the risks that you might take on associated with that. We're going to talk about best practices and then go through a customer case study. And in the middle of this, we're going to embed business value. So depending on the business that I'm in, how do I think about the cost of a customer experience that may be suboptimal? And we're going to go through different business types for that. Introduce myself and then Bharath. So I'm in a small group at New Relic, which is focused on helping our clients and prospects understand the value that we bring to their business, not just around helping you with troubleshooting, but how do we impact the entire business from productivity gains, revenue protection, revenue growth, risk mitigation, et cetera, and how do we attach dollar values to that. And so if anybody, after this has interest in kind of exploring that in your own business, I'm certainly happy to chat a little bit about that. Bharath heads up our product marketing function across a number of products. I'm going to pass it over to him for the first part of the presentation, and I'm going to come back to talk a little bit about business value about midway through.
Hey, thanks, Mike. As Mike was saying, we'll spend a lot of time talking about microservices today, why these things are super relevant for technology teams, how they're being leveraged, and the value that they bring to the table for the business itself. So when you think about a typical website, be it an e-commerce company or a media company or any sort of modern application today, you see a lot of the components on this website is driven by a number of different services. And this is just a mocked up website here. We've heard from companies like Amazon that almost every sort of section on that web page is really driven by a different microservice. And each one of those microservices is really driven by a different team. So some of these microservices are coming from their own company. Some of these microservices and APIs are being pulled from third parties. So when you pull everything together, this entire set of different microservices and third-party APIs is really making up the real customer experience that is being loaded on a particular web page. And this is not only true for web pages, but also for mobile applications. But why are folks doing this? There are a number of different drivers for this. But the most dominant one seems to be that the companies want to move faster. And when you want to move faster, you want to be able to move faster in the context of having smaller components working with each other so that your teams can work independently and drive progress very, very quickly. What that also does is that when you take a really complex application and you break it up into meaningful chunks, then you can use different sets of technologies to actually build those different modules. So we see a lot of companies using a number of different languages to build different components of their application. And what that also does is it creates a unique architecture where these different components can interact. And the most important thing is that the interfaces stay consistent, but what is within that, how these things scale, is highly dependent on how these different services are being leveraged. So it gives these teams true autonomy to make their own decisions from a technology standpoint, as well as make sure that these things work in a collaborative manner. And it definitely reduces complexity in one particular dimension, but it introduces a different kind of complexity, which we will talk about a little bit more. As we saw on the mocked up website, we saw a number of different services there. And these services come in various shapes and forms. Some of these services are server-side services. These could be shared services, things like login and authentication. Or they could be client-side services. These could be social services that you're using to make sure that your presence is being felt outside your core customers also. Then you also have application services, your core business logic being written into these different microservices. But you also have other kinds of data services and queuing systems and things like that, which are really doing discrete functions. And those functions are integral parts of the business process or these key transactions. And last but not the least, it is almost impossible to build these applications by yourself. So a lot of these companies are actually stitching together a number of third-party services, and there's lots of dependencies between them, and these third-party services themselves are using other services. So it becomes a complex web of things. And what has changed dramatically in the last several years is that folks are using containers and serverless architectures and things like that, and that has added to the increasing sprawl of microservices. So in one way, it is helping companies move a lot faster, but in another way, it's also increasing a lot of horizontal complexity to these applications. And as the complexity as well as the number of microservices increases, the risk increases, and ultimately, we're building all these great applications to create a great customer experience. So irrespective of how complex the web is behind the scenes, the customer expects these things to work in a really wonderful manner. So what are the different dimensions of service quality? So when we at New Relic think about the different dimensions, we think about it in really simple forms. The number one thing is, is my application up and running? Can users, customers come in and exercise the application and do what they need to do with it? The second thing is, are these things functional? But the most important thing is that it has to be functional, and it has to work effectively no matter what the scale is. And when you pull all these different dimensions together, and then you keep in mind the complex set of microservices behind the scenes, it becomes a really, really complex problem for one to manage. So I'm going to have Mike come back on stage here and talk about what is the business impact when some of these microservices don't function the way they should. And then I'll get back on stage to talk about some of the best practices on how to manage this.
Thanks, Bharath. So first of all, we just want to break the world down into 3 simple buckets. And if somebody has a 4th or a 5th or a 6th in their mind, that's fine, you're probably right. But most applications, or most applications that we build and deploy to customers, fall into the bucket of e-commerce, which basically means there's a checkout page, and someone either goes all the way through the process and checks out and pays money, or they don't. There's an advertising model, which means I don't have to log in or check out at all. I show up on a site, I get some content, and the publisher of that content is making money through advertising. And the third is subscription, which typically means I need to log into a system or a service, whether I'm a consumer or a business user, and I get access to content and capabilities through that service. So those are the 3 basic revenue-generating models that companies deploy to make money. And when we think about trying to help our customers quantify the cost of bad things happening, the impact to the customers in terms of revenue, we think about these basic buckets. And this may be very obvious to many of you, but it's very instructive as we go out to customers to try to figure out what business they're in and how they make money. So in the case of an e-commerce customer, let's say we're calling on a company and we know that through publicly available sources, they're doing about $250 million in revenue. And oftentimes you can find that data pretty quickly. And if you go to their website, you might be able to figure out that what they're selling looks like it's on the order of $50 per transaction. You can say, well, I bet you they're doing about 5 million transactions per year to get to that $250 million in revenue. I could be off a little bit. Could be 2 million, could be 3 million, but rough order of magnitude, that's kind of where I am. The average transaction price could be a little bit higher. And then we say, well, there's a lot of things that can go wrong as someone goes all the way through that process to try to check out, from availability issues to slow performance issues. and companies like Akamai talk about abandonment rates that grow as a function of page load time slowing down, which we're going to look at in a second. But if I said, hey, 1% of my customers who wanted to complete that transaction were not able to, that would be worth 50,000 transactions or $2.5 million in revenue. And that actually kicks off a conversation with a, with a prospect and say, well, we're not quite sure if it's 1% or 0.5% or 0.2%, but it's probably greater than 0. In the case that it is greater than 0, what's the list of things that can go wrong, and how can we monitor those microservices, APIs, et cetera? On the flip side, all of our customers are trying to grow, and the conversion rate, of course, for e-commerce companies is kind of the holy grail. How do we drive up that conversion rate while keeping the cost of customer acquisition at a reasonable place or even decreasing it? And so whatever their conversion rate happens to be, if we were able to bump that up by a small margin through more available services, faster performing services, both in browser as well as mobile devices, et cetera, that could be worth an extra 50,000 transactions or $2.5 million. And again, we like to kind of spur the thinking, and then that does drive the discussion around, well, where are you today, and what have you seen in terms of best in class conversion rates over the course of a 3-month period, 12-month period, et cetera, and how can we get close to that through better performing applications, et cetera. On the advertising side, the model is, it's really, what we're looking at is typically page views or views of videos that are streaming, and then typically advertisers make money by charging, or publishers make money by charging advertisers a cost per thousand, either a cost per thousand views, sometimes there's a cost per click component, sometimes there's a revenue per streaming video component, et cetera, but roughly it's this measurement of the number of clicks or views that go through the system. And so if you take a blended average of this and call it for a typical publisher, they might be making a $20 CPM, and these rates are published in many places. The typical range is $1 to up to $40 on a blended rate, depending on kind of what industry you're in and what kind of users you have. So that would be a $2 million monthly revenue for a company doing 100 million page views a month. Those page view figures are, again, pretty easy to get a close approximation to based on publicly available sources. And then again, we can ask the same question. Well, once someone comes to your site, we want to extend the session. We want them to see all the ads. We want them to click on the ads. And to keep it really simple, again, this doesn't include some complexities around viewing an ad impression and then clicking on that ad, so you kind of can get double paid in an advertising scenario if I see the ad and then click on it. But just to keep it very simple and look at the blended rate at $20, if I miss 1% of those page views or page loads, that could be worth $20,000 a month. So again, a quick and dirty way to start to build a story around what the potential loss could be. The growth story, again, would be a longer session and higher click-through rates, et cetera. On the subscription side, it's actually pretty interesting because you've got a couple things going on. Every subscription business has churn. There may be some of you out there that have zero churn, and if you so, please come talk to us afterwards because we want to know how you're doing that. But many churn rates are consumer and business apps 2 to 15%. There's best-in-class published rates by type of business that you're in, but you can start at 3, 4, 5% depending on what business you're in. And so again, natural churn, 4% on. So again, in this case, you would look up the revenue and say company's doing $600 million in revenue, back into what their price is based on their published prices, if it is, and many companies do publish prices. If they don't, you can kind of make some guesses in the B2B case. But a consumer subscription service might be $25 a month or $300 a year. So 2 million subscribers, $3 million, $300 a year. We can get close and say kind of that's where they might be. 4% churn, they're losing 80,000 subscribers per year. That's a lot of subscribers that they worked really hard to attain. That's worth $24 million. Now, the good news is they're growing, so the growth is exceeding the churn, but they'd certainly love to decrease that churn a bit. So then the question will be, what percent of that churn relates to application performance, availability, et cetera? We don't know, but it's probably greater than 0. And so then that allows us to say, well, what if we could For that subset of those 80,000, maybe 5% of those people couldn't get access to the application when they wanted to. Some of them submitted a support ticket. Some of them actually churned out. They said, I fly a lot, I can't access the application on my mobile device, so this is not generating the value for me that I'd like to. On the growth side, it's back to this conversion rate argument. Many subscription services, particularly on the consumer side, give free access or complimentary access to some component of the functionality, and their business model is around converting those free people to paid people. And that conversion rate, some of that conversion rate is going to be driven by how fast the application, how available is it, et cetera, et cetera. So if we can tweak that up a little bit, there's more revenue to talk to. So this is one angle of the business value of your application and the services that kind of support it. There's other things that we're not talking about here around customer support costs that rise when services aren't available, IT and developer time spent remediating issues. But this is just one angle to kind of spur some thinking around these lines. This is one of my favorite slides because some well-known retail sites have gone in and actually published and determined what the relationship is between conversion rate and load time. And you kind of see the correlation. It's much more stark than you might expect, actually. What we're looking at is at 1 to 2 second load time, the conversion rate, I think what we're looking at here is on the order of 7%, 8%. And then as we get to 4 to 5 seconds, 5 to 6 seconds, we drop all the way down to 1%. And we have some of our customers that are actually tracking this very data inside of Insights, and the results look a lot like this. And it's really, really informative. And then we can talk about, well, if we can together across your browser, your mobile experience, ensuring your services are available, bring these load times down, we can expect to see some revenue increases. Akamai published some information that looks at the data a slightly different way that says page abandonment increase as a percentage of load time. So this would be, again, quite interesting to a publisher that is making advertising revenue to say, again, I want these sessions to extend. I don't want people to abandon prematurely, or e-commerce sites that want people to go through the browse and search experience to get to the product page and then click all the way through. So as we get out to 6 seconds, 7 seconds, 8 seconds, the abandonment rate increases dramatically. Now, to kind of make this a little bit fun, and again, quite high level, but as we think about microservices again, and if you come back to the slide that Bharath showed a little bit earlier, where the risk increases as the number of microservices and APIs increases, we created kind of a hypothetical scenario of that retailer that had that sweater we were looking at. Let's say they had 500,000 visitors per month to that product page. Well, in some ways, that's a success for the product manager who owns that page because they drove the person to that sweater. And now the person has the opportunity to click on all those different microservices to get recommendations, reviews, see some more photos, et cetera. So again, all those services need to support that experience. And so let's say in that case there were actually 50 microservices and APIs. If we assumed that all of those microservices and APIs were created equally, which they're not, but if we assumed, and each of them had a chance of success of 99.95%, which is just a number, could be a lot higher, but it's probably not a 100% chance that it's available and performs as expected. What we're doing is we're saying 99.95% raised to the power of 50, 1 minus that gets us 3.4% chance that one of those services or APIs might fail. Now, again, if they were all created equally and the one that failed was the checkout page, that would be quite bad. But it might be the case that the reviews page or the review service failed and someone wasn't comfortable going all the way to checkout unless they had a successful view of the reviews. And so that might have resulted in abandonment. And so the 29% is that Akamai abandonment rate as a function of performance and availability. So if this site were doing $7.5 million in monthly revenue, it would leak $900,000 in revenue. And then if you were to imagine that you had more visibility through a synthetic monitoring service, which we'll talk about a little bit later, we could imagine that abandonment rate would come down because we would be notified earlier that that service that was going to fail would, was actually at risk, and so we would swap it out or remediate it quickly, and so that abandonment rate might come down. We're assuming some improvement factor on that abandonment rate because we get access to that data. And so that might save us $224,000 per year. So again, very hypothetical. The point of this really is the logic and how to think about what the drivers might be of revenue loss and revenue recapture as a function of having access to the data and knowing earlier on that services are unavailable or not performing as expected. So I will take it back to Bharath because we're leaking all this revenue. He's got to tell us how to get it back.
Oh, thanks, Mike. So the critical thing here is that there is a lot of complexity with microservices. There are lots of moving parts, some things that you control, some things that you don't. But it's very important for us to keep in mind that these things exist to create a great customer experience, right? And as every business out there goes towards being a true digital business, it is very important to ensure that every interaction that a customer has with the business is truly a delightful experience. So let us spend a few minutes just going back into this retail website, taking a look at the complexity here, and then thinking about how do I begin to tackle these things? How do I begin to get full visibility into what is going on with my microservices, truly understand the impact that it has on customer experience, and how do I do these things in a real-time basis, day in and day out? So as we discussed earlier, there are lots of moving parts here. Some things that you control, some things that you don't. But the more important thing is how do these different microservices interact to create the customer experience? So I'm not sure how many of you have been using the New Relic APM solution. So the APM solution from New Relic gives you complete visibility into these different applications and how they interact with each other right out of the box. So this is a screenshot from our APM solution, which is basically showing you real-time how your traffic is flowing between these different application microservices. So very quickly, you have an e-com media service, and that media service is talking to the storefront app, which is talking to the catalog service, and you know the downstream as well as upstream dependencies very quickly. And in a lot of cases, these different services are owned by different independent teams within the company, and they might not be talking on a regular basis. So very quickly, you begin to understand what is going on with these individual services, as well as what are the dependencies. Now you can begin to map out what are your critical microservices, and how are they really creating an impact on the customer experience. So once you begin to catalog these different microservices, then you should probably take a look at them and say, which are these microservices, and which ones are having more business impact, how do they connect to the key user transactions? And then after that, what is the monetary value of those business transactions? And then also look at, there are always going to be some core shared services on top of which your entire application depends on. These could be your messaging services, these could be core data services, which is looking up key customers, or your login service. So when you look at your microservices, it's very important to begin to catalog these things from multiple dimensions to understand what you have going on and which ones are changing frequently, and how do you need to monitor each one of these services. And once you have actually deployed these things, the next question is, now when I look at each one of these microservices, what do I need? What's the critical capability I need to really get a comprehensive view of how well each one of these services are actually functioning? So the first thing, the number one thing, is to begin to understand what are the key health metrics. What is the throughput? What is the response time? What are the key errors that this particular service is actually throwing? It's very important for each team that owns these microservices to have a complete view of their own microservice, because these microservices are usually auto-scaling, they're usually dependent on some other services, and there are lots of moving parts within them, especially if you're running them in containers and the dynamic cloud. So the comprehensive view of this key microservice and understanding the performance of that is really the first step. But once you do that, now you want to make sure that this service can be reached from all the different points where people can actually call them. So when you have these backend APIs, you want to make sure that these APIs can be called from different places, and they're always going to work. And right after that, because there's so many different moving parts to each one of these microservices, you want to make sure that you have dashboards that you've created that are usually different from what the engineering team cares about, what the operations teams care about. So you want to create a comprehensive view, but a view that is actually relevant to what you're trying to do, which maps out how often you're doing deployments, is the quality of service going up, going down, et cetera. And then the most important thing is that most of these folks are constantly trying to build new capability. They're constantly trying to pay down technical debt, so they're not looking at dashboards all the time. So it's super important for you to begin to use dynamic baselines to really understand what is the alert threshold that you should be setting for these key microservices, and integrate those alerts to your key workflows, be it in a Slack or HipChat or ChatOps or whatever you have. Right? So do you make sure that as soon as something begins to deviate from the normal, you catch it, and you're actually going to take meaningful action really quickly, because if you don't, then there's value leakage. And all these key points is about monitoring things in production. But the best thing that you can do is begin to take preventive measures to ensure that these things actually work in production, and make sure that actually testing these things and building quality into the lifecycle itself. So you want to make sure that you're using a lot of the APIs that New Relic itself provides to ensure that you're actually testing these things throughout your deployment pipeline to ensure that you're catching these bugs and errors much sooner. So with that context, so let's jump into New Relic, and I want to spend a few minutes walking you through how New Relic helps you deliver microservices with very, very high quality to ensure that the customer experience is great and there is no value leakage. So for starters, let's just look at the big picture here, right? So every company out there that is trying to become a digital business, or that one that's already become a digital business, you want to make sure that you're having the macro view of how your digital business is working. And this macro view is all about business outcomes. It's about business outcomes, it's about key customer interactions, and tracking these things on a real-time basis to truly understand what's going on. So we provide a pretty comprehensive view because we're able to collect a lot of this data, and all this data is going into one common place, the Insights platform. And from the Insights platform, you can create these really custom views to truly understand how your business is doing. So one of the key things that I want to point out here is the revenue at risk due to payments errors sort of tab within this dashboard. So this particular metric here, right off the bat, tells you what is the performance risk to your key application or your key microservice. So you know what you're dealing with. And this is where it really helps you as operations teams, software teams, to really begin to prioritize what you should focus on in a true real-time business. So now that you have a good comprehensive view of your overall business, then it comes down to how do we empower each one of these independent teams that own these microservices, and we give them dashboards to really understand from a technology standpoint, from a technical standpoint, how well are each one of these microservices working. So very quickly, you can see what are the failed checks. So these are synthetic transactions that are being exercised from different parts of the world to ensure that your application is always working and working well, even when users are not exercising these applications. And you can also see the site response time. You can see it by the different parts of the globe. You can see how your percentage of check failures is changing, what are the most common errors, and these are different sets of metrics that different people care about within your software team. So now that you have a good view of your macro business and what's going on with a specific microservice itself, let's do a deeper dive to truly understand, what are the diagnostics that New Relic truly provides for these individual microservices. So when you're exercising your application, be it a checkout process for an e-commerce company, there are multiple things that are happening for that particular page, for that particular action, to go back through all the different microservices and come back. So we are able to exercise these checks from different parts of the world and very quickly point out that here's a transaction, here's the overview page, and within that, which component of your page is taking a lot of time to load. And right from there, you're able to jump in to an APM Transaction Trace, where you can get down into the code level detail of what is really going on within that microservice, right? So what that means is we just walked through the macro view of how your digital business is running, what was the revenue at risk. From there, we went into specific dashboards that empower software teams to truly understand how their specific microservice is doing. And from there, we went down all the way to the code level detail here to talk about what is going on in that particular microservice and why it is working well and why it is not, right? Last but not the least, we also provide a number of SLA reporting capabilities, which also gives you historical trends. And this is super critical, especially in this API world, where you have a number of these APIs coming from third parties. So you always want to make sure that you have full visibility into how your third-party service providers are working. And in a lot of big companies, you also have implicit service levels that you have defined between the different teams. So you cannot have a microservices world where there isn't an accountability between these teams. To ensure that this thing exists and continues to drive the collaboration, you want to make sure that there is shared data and shared context that these teams have to ensure that they're working confidently every day, ensuring that each one is actually supporting the other. So to just pull this whole thing together, right? So the microservices are really changing the way applications are being built. And it's a critical architectural construct for companies to move really quickly. But with microservices comes significant risk. And with that risk comes, you have to have best practice that you bake into how you build applications, test applications, ship applications, as well as monitor them. So it's very important to have a proactive monitoring approach and an approach where you have all the different data across your application stack in one place so you can catch these problems early and take meaningful action. And ultimately, you want to make sure that you're actually tracking your historical trends, your service levels, and holding your partners more and more accountable. So I don't know how many of you heard the Jiffy presentation today? Just a quick raise of hands. I thought it was a wonderful presentation. It's a 40-person engineering team that is delivering, 500 million pages every hour or something like that. And they have hundreds and thousands of microservices running. And they have around 1,000 different partners that can either send data to them or somebody's pulling data from them. And it's a very, very highly complex microservice architecture. And the only way they can move as fast as they can because they have full visibility into their application stack. And they're also empowered these autonomous teams to truly understand what's going on a day-to-day basis, but also giving them comprehensive views on working with each other. And here's a quote from the platform engineering leader, basically says, if you don't have New Relic, the world wouldn't have as many gifts. So we feel pretty privileged that we're making lives of a lot of people more funny, I guess, with the number of these gifts out there. Last but not the least, you probably heard Lou, most of you, during the keynote. There is a huge shift in the context of how businesses are being run today. There's a huge shift in the context of the technologies being used, be it the dynamic cloud, be it microservices. And when you pull all these things together, you're driving all that to drive better customer experience, to enable companies to move faster. So this entire solution of managing microservices is just one slice of looking at how the digital intelligence platform should get deployed across software teams to really understand what is going on within your digital business and empower each one of these different stakeholders to have the right kind of data so that they can make the right kind of decisions. All right. My goal was to finish at least 10 minutes before, so we can all make it to the final presentation today. But we're happy to take a few questions if you guys have any.
And also, if you have your computers and you want to type in and play with this little calculator on potentially the cost of failure to a typical e-commerce site, you can type in that bit.ly thing.
Any comments, questions? That's a great question. The question is, this presentation was really geared towards microservices. There are lots of companies who are out there who are in their journey from going from monolithic to microservices. And how do these techniques help all those different companies. There are very few companies that have started, companies have started in the last maybe couple of years are really the true companies that have actually built on these microservice architectures, but most companies have started before that, started with some kind of monolithic services. So the way we think about when we work with our customers is that there's a constant evolution of these services. They're constantly being reconfigured to serve the needs of the business. So the complexity is continuing to increase, and the journey that these companies are taking is to take these monolithics and slowly break them into smaller components so you can actually drive the innovation. So all these techniques that we spoke about are truly relevant, and it's ultimately about the customer experience, and the impact you have on that is actually an impact that you have on the bottom line of the business itself. And then as you make these changes to your applications, you want to make sure that you're proactively monitoring these things at all those different levels, starting from a customer experience standpoint to a specific application service. It could be a large monolithic service that is going through transformation, or these individual services, but how do they all interact with each other to drive the customer experience? Any other questions? All right, thank you very much. It was very nice talking to you guys today.
Big round of applause, please.